Welcome to Grumpy Strategist episode 15. I'm Michael Shoebridge and I'm here with SAA's Dr. Marcus Hellyer.
Hello, Michael.
It's very dark in the SAA bunker today. We've been on emergency lighting, but that's just because we're testing the different disaster response and business continuity systems.
We're seeing how long we can hold out for.
Yes.
In a potentially post-apocalyptic environment.
So if this podcast ends unexpectedly in silence, that's probably just that the oxygen pumps have closed down.
Yeah, the temperature in the jacuzzi has fallen dramatically, I have to say.
So let's get straight into this. This episode is all about AUKUS submarines. They're about 5 big events and decisions in AUKUS and or submarine land that I think we should talk about. We'll scamper through those. So they start with the US budget, with a procurement cut. That cut where the US Navy said, I don't want to procure 2 Virginia-class submarines in 2025, like my previous plans. I'm only going to procure 1.
Yeah, so this unleashed, I think we can, firestorm would not be an overstatement of commentary here. Certainly strong reactions in Washington as well. Parts of Congress not very happy about that.
Yes.
But here there has been all kinds of commentary, and a lot of the AUKUS opponents have said this shows that AUKUS is dead in the water. I don't think I've seen that phrase used so many times as I have in the last couple of weeks.
Well, and it's bad for a submarine to be dead in the water.
Very dead in the water.
That is a big statement. Yep.
Meanwhile, the AUKUS supporters have said nothing to see here. Don't worry, it's all tracking well. I guess my view is I'm a little in the not that much to see here camp, but that doesn't mean everything is fine with AUKUS. So what's your immediate response to this?
I'm in the camp that sees goldfish in evidence here. So the commentary on AUKUS submarine problems and challenges in Australia, the US and UK strikes me as very like a goldfish that keeps swimming around the same rock and being surprised when it sees it each time. So remember last year we had that whole drama about will the US Congress pass AUKUS enabling laws? Will they invest in the US submarine base? Which it ended up doing. And when that event passed, everybody went from AUKUS could be in trouble to hysterical cheerleading about how fantastic it was and how AUKUS was never going to have a problem ever again. Here we are just a few short months on and we're going through the same pantomime. So it's a bit like, as you say, everyone that is critical of AUKUS sees a message in this. Everybody that's pro-AUKUS says there's nothing to see here.
Yeah, it is a microcosm of that broader path that I think AUKUS is taking, which is a bit like the Israel-Palestine path, and that is before you can have a discussion, you have to declare your allegiance. But if you declare that you're on the other side, then I don't have to listen to you because you're clearly an idiot.
Which is awkward for me because I feel like I'm in the middle of these positions. So I would like AUKUS to succeed. I'm not sure nuclear submarines are the magical answer to capability and strategic stability. I think they have an enormous distorting effect on the force structure. But if the 3 governments are determined to have them, I would at least like the best path to be taken to make that happen.
And this is the problem. I think we're in danger of entering a no analysis zone because everybody's made up their minds. And if you're on the other side, you're an idiot and we shouldn't be listening to you. But I agree that if we are going down this path, we need to make sure it's happening well, which requires analysis and constructive criticism.
Yes, well, you can't suspend critical analysis just because you really want it to work. In fact, you need
or just because
analysis.
Both major parties think this is the right way to go.
What do I think the message is out of the US Navy reducing its procurement of Virginia-class submarines from 2 to 1? I think it shows the continued challenge that the US industrial base has to produce submarines. And so the US Navy has said, what's the point of giving you more money to build submarines you haven't got the capacity to build? Maybe when you're building more of them every year, I will fund you for more of them. But until then, I'm going to put my scarce money on something else. So this is just a symptom of the enduring long-term challenge that the US has building enough nuclear submarines for itself, let alone additional ones for us.
Yeah, I think the thing that people are missing here is that there is a difference between procurement and production. Procurement is really the agreement to buy something. You could call it in Australian terms second pass, but it is not when you get into contract, it is not the start of production, and it is certainly not delivery. And unlike here, the US budget documentation gives very clear information about when all of those dates dates are predicted to occur. So the submarine whose procurement has been deferred from this year, if you look at the details in the budget documentation, nothing has changed around the start of construction for that boat, predicted, we should say, or the predicted delivery. So the US Navy still thinks it's going to get everything back on track. And so I think they're thinking we've made these investments in the industrial base, they're going to start flowing through and everything will get back on track. Now, you can disagree with that.
Well, but what is everything back on track? Everything back on track is the US Navy has a historic low number of nuclear attack submarines in the early 2030s. And nothing that happens from here can do anything to make that situation better in submarine production land. It can only get worse.
Yeah, so I think this is the fundamental message is when you go through the US budget documentation, this year's and previous years, nothing has occurred that will increase the number of Virginia-class submarines in existence in 2032, when we're meant to be getting our first one. Nothing has increased that number since before AUKUS. So it's still the same plan, ultimately, as before AUKUS. Now, in the longer term, more boats will likely flow through. But when we get to 2032, the US Navy's not going to have any more submarines than was the case back in 2019.
And they've been reinvesting in their production capability for some years now, and it has not yet borne fruit in increased production capacity.
What that means for Australia, I think we have slightly different views here. So again, my view is, okay, when you look at the numbers of boats on paper, the US Navy's still going to have the same number of submarines it was planning back in 2019, which is less than they want. Now, to me, that doesn't stop a US president transferring a submarine to Australia. I mean, if you look at the US Navy shipbuilding plans for years now, they haven't been making any progress. So back in 2016, they set a goal of reaching 355 submarines.
The ships and submarines.
Ships and submarines, sorry. They're meant to be at about 316 and
if they're on the path to getting the 355 ship Navy. Yep.
They're at 286. They're essentially where they were when they started 8 years ago, 30 behind where they are meant to be. The world has not ended. The US Navy is still doing operations. So I think just by looking at their plan on a page and saying they're not going to have enough submarines, to me doesn't mean AUKUS is dead in the water.
Oh, I agree with you, but I do think the fact that there'll be about 20 attack submarines short of their desired fleet number, and we're only talking about, will they have 46 or 66? That is a big gap between what they say they need and what they'll actually have. And if the world keeps getting more dangerous more quickly, it gets a harder ask to have a US president say, I won't meet our Navy's critical requirements first for our security. I'm going to divert scarce submarines off to those great Australian mates. I think it just gets politically harder because the pressure on the US Navy's own capability gets more intense.
Yeah, and I see that point. But let's think about where are we in, say, 2031s? We'll be theoretically 4 years into submarine regional force west. There'll be potentially 3 or 4 US submarines in Western Australia.
Yep, we'll be beyond the next US president. There will have been another election by then.
But one of those boats, you could imagine, is that's been designated as the transfer to Australia. So it may start off with a 80-20 US Australian crew, and each year that number increases and the Australian component changes, and by the time we get to 2032, gotten to sort of a 60-40 Australian US number, and they go, all right, well, we'll just change the flag on that boat.
Yep.
Mission accomplished. We've stood up the Australian submarine force. And if that doesn't happen in 2032, it could happen in 2033, 2034. And so, I think it'll slowly happen. And unless we have massive political meltdown somewhere, it'll slowly happen.
Yeah, the counter argument is, I think you're right, it could be quite a symbolic gesture at that point because it's a minor shift almost in what's already happening. A majority Australian crewed submarine instead of a majority American crewed submarine. So it could be very just done through symbolism. But the point to me is there won't be a single extra Virginia-class submarine in the water in 2032 or even in the years after that than we know will be there now, and the Americans will be at their historic low point in submarine numbers for themselves in a more dangerous contested world with still probably a very aggressive China. So the pressure on the American system to look after its own needs first before it helps us fabulous Australian allies is only going to grow. And that goldfish will keep swimming around the rock, and notice it looks like a bigger rock every time over the years from now to then.
Yeah, look, I agree. I mean, when you look at the numbers, whether we're looking at the US budget in 2019, 2020 or today, nothing that has occurred since AUKUS has increased the number of Virginia-class submarines that will exist by 2032. So there will be, I think, difficult decisions for a US president to make.
Yes, and then that may be a contested decision with different advice out of the US Navy, the Pentagon and the Congress, for example. Now, there was another big AUKUS development, submarine development, last week, and that was in the AUKMIN, Australia-UK ministerial meetings. So we had the UK Foreign Secretary and UK Defence Secretary come to Australia, meet with Penny Wong and Richard Marles, and out of that came another big cash announcement. So it's old news that we're giving the Americans $3 billion to invest in their submarine base for American jobs and growth in the submarine
technically,
sector.
I don't think it's happened yet.
But we haven't handed the money over, but it's been announced we will. Well, last week at AUKMIN, our government said we're going to give the UK 4.6 billion Australian dollars to sort of rebuild their own submarine industrial base, which we know from a UK parliamentary report that was put out in early March is actually in terrible shape.
So we know from this parliamentary report that draws on a UK Audit Office report, that draws on an earlier study, there are 5 major UK defence programs that are rated red, meaning they're not achievable, and quite disturbingly, one of them is the Naval Nuclear Reactor program. So I think we can see why the UK is into AUKUS, because essentially it means they're getting a huge cash injection. I think, Michael, you described Australia as an angel investor, where we're handing over a very large amount of money to essentially bail out their own failing nuclear reactor program. So on the one hand, you go, yes, well, if you want nuclear submarines, you have to pay for them. So part of this 4.6 is for the reactor program. Part of it seems to be our share of the detailed design contract with BAE that the UK government signed recently.
So it's going to BAE and Rolls-Royce, because BAE is the designer, Rolls-Royce makes the reactors.
Yeah, so you sort of go, you want these things, you have to pay for them. But I do have to say it's a little concerning that we are essentially committing ourselves to a program that is under some fairly serious pressure, which to me raises that question that we've considered before and never really gotten a good answer to, and that is, why are we going with the UK?
So this is right back to the San Diego announcement, isn't it? So the optimal pathway is getting Virginia submarines first, 3 to 5 of them, and the fact that we don't know if it's 3, 4 or 5 says there's already, in the minds of the AUKUS leaders,
there are schedule risks around Snorkus.
With Snorkus, the UK designed boat. And in fact, all this news out of the UK about the failing nature of their nuclear reactor program says delays look perfectly credible to the UK-designed Snorkus boat. But the optimal pathway has Australia operating 2 classes of the world's most complex submarine in very short order. And I just wonder, with this new news about the parlous state of the UK submarine industrial base, does the path look optimum?
Well, I've never really thought it was optimal. If this was the optimal pathway, there must have been some really terrible ones that we didn't go down. So you ask yourself, why are we going down this pathway? I mean, it's very clear that AUKUS is about China. And in fact, 2 UK ministers were out here last week as part of the announcement of the 4.6 million, reminding us that AUKUS is all about China and reminding us, I think they have a slight interest here, that we need SSNs to counter China. It was very nice of the UK to tell us that we needed to buy their submarines. The funny thing was, however, is at the exact same time, our own ministers were receiving a visit from the Chinese foreign minister, and we were told there's really nothing to see here. Everything's sort of back on track.
I found that quite jarring. So we also didn't hear from our Australian ministers, Penny Wong, who was busily hosting her counterpart, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, or Richard Marles, any of that frankness about why we're getting these, why we're spending $368 billion to get nuclear submarines. We had to outsource that to our visiting UK people to tell us. In fact, if you listen to our government ministers about why we're doing AUKUS, you would think it was all about high-paying jobs in Australia and obviously also propping up high-paying jobs in our AUKUS partners. So $4.6 billion to the UK for jobs.
Will be some jobs in the US and UK. But
$3
I
billion
think we
for the
need to
US.
come back and talk about the industrial aspects and give it a whole episode of its own, because there's a lot to talk
Well,
about
I think
there.
you're right. We hear about we're reinvesting in what was announced in San Diego last year about this optimal pathway of Virginia's then snorkers.
So if it's all about China, the question I've always asked is, why are we not sticking with a US boat? I mean, the US is very concerned about China. The US is operating in the same region as us, dealing with the same operating environment, the same threats, and yet we're going to get a different boat from them eventually. So I've never quite understood that. The only explanation I've seen on paper was in the infamous Senate estimates brief that the Australian Submarine Agency took to Senate estimates last year and released under an FOI request.
Yeah, so we didn't even get it out of testimony, did we? We got it after the hearings through someone asking for it under FOI.
Correct.
Freedom of information.
And in there is a line where the advice to the defence seniors before the committee says, if asked why we're not just sticking with Virginia boats after we get the first three, the response apparently is that the US schedule doesn't really work for us, because the US is going to stop making Virginias and move on to their next generation boat, the so-called SSNX, and poor old Australia would be left making Virginias, operating Virginias after the US has
it'll
moved
be
on.
an orphan design, and they're not making them anymore, so you can't have 8 of them anyway.
But that whole justification, I think, has now fallen apart, because the other really interesting thing that was in the US budget documentation is the US Navy has said it's going to delay the start of the SSNX program by a further 5 years. On top of the 5 years they delayed it by a couple of years ago. So it's now slid 10 years and won't start production probably until about 2050. So that, in a sense, brings our programs into alignment. We could buy the first 3 Virginias transferred from the US Navy and set up a production line for a boat that's already in existence, build the first 5, and then transition with the US to SSNX.
Well, and the logic there, I think, is so the Americans were originally going to, I think, start that program with SSNX in the early 2030s. Now they're not going to start it till the 2040s. They won't be delivering boats out of that until the 2050s.
They're aiming for procurement.
Yep.
2042, I thought, 2040 or 2042.
Yeah.
And as we know, procurement is not production. Production wouldn't start until later in the 40s, and I think the first boat could not be delivered before 2050.
Well, it'd be a first of class of a new design, which means the US is going to need to keep producing Virginias.
Correct,
Because
yes.
it can't turn the industrial base off.
No.
So it's going to keep producing Virginias until probably 2050.
Yeah. So the one argument that Defence has ever sort of put down on paper for taking the so-called optimal pathway of a UK boat, I think really falls apart. But I think the other sort of takeaway from the SSN delay just shows that the US too is really under huge budget pressure. I mean, what we're seeing now is the complexity of modern warships is so huge now that it takes so long to design them. They're so expensive that they just can't afford to get new vessels into service. So the Virginia, they will have been producing Virginias for 50 years under that
And
plan.
it was designed, remember, to be the lower cost alternative because they'd already been down the death spiral of it's too expensive to build and maintain. The maintenance cost is big here too. That was the story of the Seawolf, and it happened with the surface ships with the Zumwalt class. So a big lesson to me, looking at the UK and US budget and submarine and other defence production systems, is we're starting to get to the point where next generation platforms are just too expensive both to procure and then to operate. So we really need to get off this cost curve. Even the giant US, the reason they delayed SSNX is they couldn't afford the program.
No, and that's stated very clearly in the budget documentation. So we've spoken before about the cost capability death spiral of platforms becoming more complex and bigger, more difficult to design, more expensive, so we end up with less and less of them. And we are right in the middle of that. Now, on the one hand, I said, well, maybe we should get off the Snorkers train and get on the SSNX train, but I think the SSNX is going to be incredibly expensive. Again, the US Congressional Budget Office has, I think, come up with a number of 7 to 8 billion US per copy. So,
well, there's a lot of
that's
time
probably like
between now and then.
12 billion Australian per boat.
There's a lot of time between now and then, and it could well be the future of US nuclear submarines submarines is evolved Virginias off into the distance until they eventually become obsolete. But there's one other little development in submarine land which I don't think I could not talk about. It really is black comedy, but it shows Australia really is willing to fund other people's defence, probably in a bigger way than we fund our own. So think about that. We're giving billions to the Americans. We're giving billions to the Americans for their submarine industrial base. We've just proudly announced $4.6 billion going to our friends, the UK. But in a quieter success for Australian defence spending, the French naval group, Naval Group, have just won the Dutch submarine program in competition against the Swedes and the Germans. And
Sorry, can I interrupt, Michael? Naval Group make the short fin Barracuda conventional submarine.
Yep.
That they were actually designing for Australia under the Attack Class program.
That's right. That was our boat.
So that was the boat we spent a number of years designing until the previous government, if I recall, said we don't want this boat because it is going to be obsolete the moment it is launched.
Yep.
And apparently that assessment was supported by the entire senior leadership of the Defence Department.
Including the then Chief of Navy. That's right.
So this obsolete piece of the proverbial, what you're telling me is that the Dutch have just run a submarine competition and they have picked that boat. Are they idiots? Like, what is wrong?
Well, they said it was...
Did they bring in Scott Morrison as a consultant to advise them in this process? Or, like, what were they doing?
They said it was going to give them a leading-edge capability in the undersea world, and that compared to the German and Swedish competitors, it was the outstanding winner. It's the submarine that John West rejected, really, isn't it?
Well, there is a silver lining. I think that's where you were going. So Australia spent, some would say wasted, but actually it looks like it's now a foreign aid investment, $4 billion on the Attack Class program. So presumably that has helped mature the design to the benefit of the Dutch. So $4 billion off the top of my head, I think is about $160 per man, woman and child in Australia. So your family, Michael, that's $800. So you should feel you've done a good deed because you have subsidised the Dutch and French.
I feel great in three ways.
To the tune of $800.
We have subsidised French submarine workers to develop the design, and we've kept them in work with that $4 billion of Australian money. We've help the Dutch have a more cost-effective submarine program because they don't have to pay Naval Group $4 billion to develop the design. We've already paid for that, so they're getting a lower-cost submarine at the end of this. And it's a real enhancement of European defence capability and security at a time when they need that. So I think Australians can feel great about being bigger than ourselves and not just focused on where we spend our own money.
Well, I think, all of these contributions, so 4.7-ish going to the US, 4.6 going to the UK, 4 billion going to the French and Dutch. That should all figure, I think, be accounted for under our foreign aid budget.
Yes. The only criticism I can think of there is these are all very wealthy nations who probably don't need Australian taxpayer money.
If you're going to be like that, it's so negative.
So that is just a canter through the world of AUKUS and submarines. I think when you look at it,
it's a fast-moving world, submarine land. I mean, you look away for a couple of weeks and all of these huge developments occur. So, very fast-paced. Good thing that the grumpy strategists are staying on top of it.
It is indeed. I'll just end by saying it's great to see the Australian generosity, but if you're in any other part of defence than the submarine program, you might start to be getting a bit worried about, are you going to be able to meet the costs of your own capabilities?
Well, just allow me a few seconds to put some numbers around that, because I do think they are quite telling. So the government has said that we will be spending in the financial decade $50 to $58 billion on the SSN Enterprise. That will get us to delivery of the first boat. Similarly, the Hunter class program is probably going to be in the order of $25 to $30 billion over the decade before we get the first Hunter class frigate. So you add those two numbers together and we're looking at $80 to $90 billion over the next decade in two programs only before we get any real world capability. Now that's amazingly good news if you're BAE and its shareholders.
Yes. Yes.
It's probably in my view, not such great news for the Australian taxpayer, but it's terrible news for other parts of the ADF, that with this massive cash drain over the coming decades.
Yes, and over a decade, that is the most dangerous period for Australia since the Second World War, according to the current government. So, yes, it is worth really watching what's going on in submarine land if you're interested in submarines, but if you're not interested in submarines, for the effect that this program is having on the rest of our security and our military capability. Marcus, great to talk with you.
Thank you, Michael.